to approach the Old Testament as a compound. We know that for Christian people, the Old Testament forms a background or a frame for the messianic revelation to which Christendom is particularly, I think, the religious faith. This is entirely a different viewpoint from that of the Orthodox Jew, who does not regard the Old Testament as really a complementary volume or work. He is willing to admit that particularly the prophetic books of the Old Testament do contain intimation or announcement of the coming of a Messiah. Christian theologians have assumed, rather dogmatically, that these intimations and implications refer to the advent of Jesus. Here, of course, is one of the major points of difference between Judaism and Christianity. This attitude is not acceptable in general to the Orthodox Jewish scholar. He points out many elements of the Old Testament account which would sustain his position that the New Testament is not a fulfillment of the Old. The two books have been brought together for other purposes, or at least have achieved a different purpose. In survey, we must remember that the New Testament, as it stands, is essentially a moral historical document. It deals with the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and to a degree of the lives of his immediate disciples and apostles. It passes into the Pauline epistles and gradually develops a related field of literature. It is a powerful moral work. It is a tremendous statement of mystical faith, and it is a strong and definite revelation of religious ethics. If the New Testament is deficient in one particular, when compared with most of the sacred books of the world, it is deficient in cosmology. It is deficient in anthropology. In other words, it does not carry into its own substance any essential description or explanation. For this reason, the Old Testament forms an appropriate background. It answers certain questions concerning the race and the nation from which Jesus came, the beliefs of this race, the unfoldment of their religious and political psychology, the rise and fall of their national existence. And furthermore, it gives us a broad picture of the psychological structure of the Jewish people of that time, and of their religious problems, and of their general attitude towards the essentials of spiritual life. And it should be included, seems to be more than justified with the words of Jesus himself, when he proclaimed definitely that he came not to destroy the prophets, but to fulfill them. And in order that the position of the prophet whom he came to fulfill might be understandable, it was almost inevitably necessary to link the Old Testament and the New. The Old Testament was not written originally in the same language as the New Testament. The linguistic difficulties in the older Chaldaic Hebrew are far more ponderous and numerous than those of Greek. Up to the present time, no really ancient manuscript of the Old Testament in the Jewish language is known. Nearly all of the so-called scrolls and Pentateuch now to be found in synagogues are translations and retranslations from the Greek. The oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament are to be found in the Greek manuscripts of the Bible, the Syriac and the Vatican. These manuscripts, dating from about the 3rd century, are the oldest comprehensive we have. There are earlier fragments, but they do not give us too large or full an understanding. Thus we know that we are confronted with serious problems of life. And we must gradually recover from our popular belief that the Bible was written in the King James, at the request of King James the First of England. It was not. This is an exaggeration. The Old Testament was probably revised or codified sometime about the 5th century B.C. There is a strong record, or tradition at least, not unofficial, let us point that out, but still rather strongly defended, that the earlier writings were almost completely destroyed, and that during the time of Ezra, a group of scholars forming a rabbinical college, working together, perhaps under the leadership of one or two of the older patriarchs, rewrote or revised and brought into an illustrated form the earlier and lost manuscripts of the Jewish Bible. Now, this may or may not be a sensible attitude or belief, but it is certainly traditional and has been in existence for a long time. Nor is it essentially unreasonable, for it is quite possible that a religious literature in Palestine, 1,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era, was highly respectable. In those days, manuscripts were very few, and copying was an exceedingly difficult undertaking. Therefore, it is quite possible that not many manuscripts of the Torah, or of the prophetic books, or of the literary works, were available. These could either have been lost or so hopelessly misplaced that they were not available. This point, of course, is also strengthened by the fact that they had never discovered their writing, and therefore they could not have been especially numerous. We have many, many copies of the Egyptian manuscripts going back as far as 2,000 or 3,500 BC. But we have no such available manuscripts relating to the Old Testament. Thus, it is quite possible that the literature was exceedingly limited in amount and perished, or nearly perished, in the numerous vicissitudes which afflicted the tribes of Israel. So much for its basic historical orientation in the limited time that we have. The second point for consideration is the authorship of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is generally referred to as the 5 books of Moses. We have, however, no absolute proof that Moses was their author, nor do we gain such an evidence or proof from the reading of the books themselves. Most of the writing is in the third person. This, however, is not again concluded because of the grammatical form used at that time. We do not, however, have the internal or sustained traditional evidence to prove that Moses is the actual author of these books. He is the traditionally accepted author. It is not impossible that he did write that. This is one of the religious uncertainties which is as yet unsolvable. Some groups, composed of rather adequate scholars, are inclined to favor the belief that Moses did write these books. There are others who feel definitely that he probably did not. Then there is a third group, occupying a thought more or less middle ground, that point out that according to the custom and the society of the time, Moses undoubtedly would have made use of scribes. In other words, he probably would not have written the books with his own hand. He would use professional writers or secretaries. And that these may have changed from time to time, and thus we will have certain editorial differences, different methods of presenting material. This is quite possible. Also, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that although we might attribute the authorship of the Pentateuch to Moses, that there are fragments, sections, and parts of it that are almost certainly derived from older sources. Some of these sources may have been Egyptian. Some of them may have been oral traditions of surrounding tribes and groups. But frequently, in the unfoldment of the Mosaic writings, we find interludes or interpolations which can definitely be traced to other sources. These include a considerable part of the opening of Genesis. And the Chaldean tables, now in the British Museum, are translated by Professor Piazza, indicate that a considerable part of Genesis story was derived from the Chaldean Cuneiform, a much older tradition, going back long before even the so-called Hebraic state of creation. Thus, we can find the probability of several authors, or we can find several layers or levels of writing representing extracts from different periods. We must also face the inevitable that there are interpolations of a later date that could not possibly have been written by Moses. Whether these interpolations were originally glossed and were gradually incorporated into the text, we do not know. But we do know that this particular occurrence has taken place in the Christian writings, and a number of the sources of as late as the 8th century indicate that scribes made marginalia, or notes on the edges, and later scribes incorporated these notes into the text, so that we have a little story arising from this gradual law of lines of demarcation between original material and interpolated or interpreted material of a more recent date. The Jewish religious tradition is a much more complicated one than we are first inclined to assume. These people, as you can well imagine, being an ancient and oriental nation, developed immense and incredible religious hostility. They were never content merely to accept the letters and forms and shapes of things. They always sought for something deeper, something more important. And in the development of their sacred writings, they appear to have incorporated many mysterious cabals or cycles into the text of their work. These cycles originated at least in part from their concept of language. Originally, the old Hebraic or Chaldean Hebraic language was rather more limited than it is today. There was probably a time when the complete alphabet was not consisted of more than about 10 or 12 letters. It is sometimes assumed that there were originally 7 consonants and 3 vowels. This may not be entirely correct, but it does indicate that as we retire further into the background of language, we are inclined to note increasing signs of deficiency of available words and terms. This particular problem does present itself to Bible students. We are not at all sure of all of the grammatical constructions of the old Jewish and rabbinical teaching. The same problem concerns with Jewish narrative. Since the work of Sappho and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, we can translate such Egyptian manuscripts as Books of the Dead and other divine practices, descriptions, saints, mortuary offerings, prayers. But we are not at all sure that we are exhausting the potential of the language. Thus, Professor of the University of Chicago told me in his work in connection with Egyptian manuscripts that he was quite certain that many of the word signs and glyphs had double meaning, and that we have simply lost the knowledge of the better and deeper meaning. This would be definitely true in connection with the old Jewish writings. Jewish scholars themselves know definitely that there are meanings to these words and to the combinations of them, with which we are no longer connected. Therefore, that we can see the surface, but we cannot penetrate into the subsurfaces of the ideas and mental processes of the time. This could and does lead to a great deal of danger and error. And where we have not the psychic sympathy with the original, we cannot any longer use the idiom of the artist. We are at a very serious disadvantage. Even today, the American people do not use their language correctly. And if a scholar does use it correctly, it is likely to be misunderstood. And this follows all words, signs, and habits. Words change their meaning. were increasing importance and decreasing, and structured in the same way. The beginning of the study of the Old Testament then should naturally and reasonably begin with a careful study of the philosophy of Hebraic language. Without some knowledge of this particular field, there is always going to be a very difficult situation at hand. The writing is not always on the surface. The writing is definitely subsurface. We know, for example, that due to certain religious conditions, the old texts are left without vowels. And the later development of diacritical marks does not indicate any sure knowledge of where they belong or how they should originally have been used. Thus we have only traditional forms, and even these change from time to time. The Hebrew writings, or the Chaldaic Hebrew letters, have a common origin, and it is rather important to give a little thought to that as we go by. I'm not going to step down that far. This letter, the Hebrew alphabet, is a tiny little mark that resembles a comma. It is called a yod. It's made like that. Now this letter actually, as far as we can learn, means a flame. In other words, the entire alphabet is composed of combinations of flames. Now in this we begin to find, for example, something that I have often believed and long suspected, namely, that the Hebrew scriptures are very largely books interpreting the basic concept of Jewish philosophy which is in the letters themselves, and not in the writings which are composed of these letters. Now, the original letter is susceptible of appearing in numerous patterns and forms. We can take one of these notes in this way. We can add another note to it, and another note to it, and we have the Hebrew letter A. Well, this is really composed of three flames. Now, what does the letter A itself mean in Hebrew? It means fire. Therefore, it is the beginning of the alphabet. It is a restatement of the strange beliefs of these people in the association of letters and fire. James Gattaro, who was the astronomer and scholar extraordinary to Cardinal Richelieu, believes that these flame points and the original structures of letters were derived from the constellation. In other words, the seasonal flames represented stars. And in certain early forms of Hebrew writing, we still find them represent as star forms. These then constituted the original of the handwriting of the law of heaven. Now, if we consider the fixed stars and their groupings to form the consonantal letters of the Hebrew language, then we are not very far off either when we suspect that the planets moving in the orbit of the constellation became the vowels. And as these vowels constantly change their relation to the consonants, it is conceivable that an endless group of words can be formed. And that these words change because of the motion of the vowels through the consonantal form. This is a very old belief, by the way, and perhaps we have some to sure. Now, in the early Pentateuchal writings, we have the Hellenistic form of the name of God, which is also very important to us at this particular stage in our study, because the name of God is written in this form, the Yod and the final end. Because it is written from left to right, and consists of A-L-H-I-M. We generally pronounce that as Elohim, or more perhaps correctly, Elohim. Now it was It is the Elohim that in Genesis moved upon the face of the deep. Because up to that time, the other God form was to finally take its place. And which was to then continue throughout the entire life. These, of course, if they are completely drawn, are also all plain. And this will take you time to draw them completely. This form, of course, is the IHDH, which we translate Jehovah, or Yah, but which the Orthodox Jew in the old days never pronounced at all. Whenever he came to this name, he used another name or another word, in order that the name of deity might not be spoken or profaned in any way. He was therefore wrote that to say Adonai, or Lord, because he was not inclined to use his sacred form so freely. Now let us, for example, change this pattern for a moment, and let us begin here, and rewrite. I'm going to do it rather, quickly, because I don't want to take the time. The name Elohim. Then we place here, for our purposes, we have 5 letters. And against these 5 letters, we can, for your own convenience, if you wish to do so, write the words Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, it may not at first appear particularly sensible, but let us remember that the revelation of the Pentateuch is actually contained within the name Elohim and becomes the basic key to it. And by the use of the name, we also gain a knowledge of what is meant by the various books of the Pentateuch. Therefore, the beginning of the Pentateuch is represented by the 5-letter A. The second part of the Pentateuch, which is what is called the historical and religious unfoldment, is under the letter or L. The next part, which is the revelation of the Levitical law, is under the H. Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers. Numbers is peculiarly and serenely important because in the book of Numbers it's concealed by the text itself the significance of the letter Yod, because in this, the letter Yod being the most primary and complete and perfect symbol of God, it is in this book that the revelation to Moses on Sinai is contained. The last word, which is the recapitulation and contains the 3 great discourses of Moses on the establishment of the law, is under the final end. And if you study the words very carefully, you will realize that they do absolutely unfold the power of the Elohim or the Creator. The 5 powers of these creators being represented through the unfolding of the books themselves. Now, this is, I won't be going to do this much for a moment because we can't take the time with our problems to go into it. But this is the way it will be approached by the old scholars of Pentateuch. They would begin to seek for the original meaning, tying the languages to the basic concepts involved. In other words, every part of it contains mathematical formulas. Each of the Hebrew letters is a number. The numbers add up. They can be divided. They can be progressed for the same general concept that we find in the Pythagorean system of the Greeks, and which later occurs in the Gnostic views the numerical piece to the New Testament. All of these elements are part of one strange and peculiar and remarkable story. Perhaps the most important thing that they teach us immediately is to convey the inclination to go further, to realize that we do not exhaust the potential of this situation by memorizing merely the biblical stories themselves. Now, as we have only a certain amount of time, I'd like to more or less check over with you, in brief, the plan, the scheme that unfolds through the Pentateuch. These books are not merely separate writings. They are the integrated parts of one story. They consist of a prologue, Genesis, and an epilogue, Deuteronomy. And between these two are placed the remaining three books, in their order, and in a sequence which is acceptable not only to the historian, but to the psychologist and the sociologist. Concealed within the elaborate Oriental process, with its rich emphasis upon genealogies and the defense of families, and its heavy concern with the wanderings of the tribes and their wars, and the various healings and the various revelations that were given. The story unfolds essentially in a simple way. The purpose of Genesis is not primarily to present the story of creation, for it is limited to only a very few chapters. The true purpose of Genesis is to establish the integrity of the Pentateuchal dispensation. Its purpose is to remind the reader and the speaker of the setting aside of a chosen people, a people peculiarly and wonderfully provided for and protected, that through them and through their works and through their labor, a dispensation of law might be revealed. The entire emphasis in the Pentateuch is upon the unfoldment of this dispensation of law. Now, it is not by any means the theme which exhausts the wealth of the symbolism of these books, but it is the great thread that runs through the 5 Ds. The first book, therefore, deals primarily with the answer to the question, why the dispensation, or the question, how it came about. And in this we see the gradual representation of the selectivity on the part of the creating power. Now, this selectivity is perfectly traditional religiously. It is to be found wherever sacred books are found. In every system of sacred books belonging to an ancient people or race, the integration shows the emphasis upon that race and culture. In other words, the race is explaining itself. It is telling the story of its own psychic entity or its own psychic existence. It is telling us the deepest motivations which it can comprehend for its own creation and perpetuation. Thus, in the work in the book of Genesis, we also have a moral or spiritual situation established, by means of which the rest of the Pentateuch becomes inevitably necessary. In other words, wherever we develop a concept, we must create a pattern. And the concept becomes the basis of the precept, or that which naturally and inevitably follows it. Thus, the kind of a dispensation, the rules and laws of its maintenance and its development, and the need for all of the various ramifications that later arise, must be established in the basic premise. And in Genesis, we have the basic premise, not only of the Mosaic tradition, but to a very large degree of the Christian doctrine which followed after. In the opening chapters of Genesis, therefore, we are presented with a story of a divine creation, disobedience, and a fall. In other words, we find the individual establishing an interval between himself and God. An interval which must be crossed by repentance, by a life of virtue, by obedience to law, and by the gradual integration of the concept of a moral and religious life. Had the fall not been in the opening chapters of Genesis, there would have been no need for Leviticus or Deuteronomy or Numbers. There would have been no need for a messianic redeemer, unless there had been original sin. So in the Pentateuch, we find the primary symbolic statement of man's needs. We find the tremendous spiritual necessity by which all of the rest of the work, in fact all the moral cultures of religion, are seen to depend. Now, in this particular instance, we have a situation in which disobedience causes the departure of man from the paradisical state and forces him to take upon himself the burden of original sin. We find, therefore, that he is exiled from his native land and from his proper spiritual abode. He is exiled also from the conscious power to apprehend the presence of God. And after he has been expelled from the garden, he no longer is able to know the Lord who walks in the garden of the cool of evening. He is deprived, therefore, of the direct and immediate knowledge of God. Now, this particular concept, of course, is not original in Jewish literature. It belongs to a great religious tradition which has existed since time immemorial. But it is the springboard, or the foundation, of the life of repentance. It is the concept which lies behind man's search for a lost truth, a lost word, a lost reality, a hidden God. Thus the Pentateuch must establish this, as it does in the opening chapters of Genesis. In these opening chapters, there is a brief summary of what it seems to me is the Sumerian account of the Genesis. In other words, this story is based upon the traditions, lore, and legendary of the Sumerian people and of the Akkad and of other peoples inhabiting the ancient area of the valley of the Euphrates. This creation itself, with its exceptionary division, this creation can be given a very great deal of consideration. We can only touch upon one or two of the more essential elements of it. We find, for example, in this creation concept, we have first presented it with the concept of the Elohim. Now, in this Jewish language or Jewish tradition realize, this term, Elohim, representing creative power, is an androgynous plural word. The end termination means equivalent to R.S. Therefore, the Elohim cannot be regarded as a monotheistic being. They can only be accepted, as they were in Egypt and in Syria and in other lands, as harmonious artifices, a proof of creating power. And in this, we also find the revival later, which has often been assumed to be an empiric form, but which does not necessarily follow from the Jewish writings. Namely, and God said, "Let us make man in our image." It seems again to suggest a reference back to the Elohim form, although by that time we are beginning to find the Yahvistic or monotheistic deity taking over in the text. Thus we observe as we proceed that the same word is not used for God in all parts of the Bible. But this term changes. The reason for this change, I think we will be able to understand as we proceed. There have been many questions as to where the story of Adam and Eve came from. Again, I don't think we can dogmatize, but research seems to indicate that most of these stories, such as the Osirian legend in Egypt, and of course the Dionysian cycle in Greece, and certain of the Brahmanic cycles in Far Asia all originated from religious drama or play. That in all probability, at a remote time, these stories were actually enacted, and the candidates seeking initiation into their tribal rights, much as the American Indians of our own Southwest today, passed through initiatory rituals in which religious incidents are dramatized. There is much to indicate from the form and construction that the original story of the fall of man was at some time in the remote past part of the religious pageantry of a great philosophical religious system, and that gradually the story was transformed into an account whereas it at one time had been witnessed or beheld as an actual dramatic action. The story itself deals undoubtedly with certain factors which have been universally revered by mankind since the beginning of time. The study of the name Adam, like the study of the name Eve, also tells us that we are not primarily dealing with people. We are dealing with collectives, or we are dealing with qualities of life and consciousness. We are not dealing with a physical, biological story. And this is one of the solutions which will ultimately be very valuable to us. Because when we begin to recognize the philosophical aspect of the matter and the symbolism, we are no longer in conflict with physical anthropology. We are no longer in conflict with science. Because our problem belongs on an entirely different level. Therefore, it does not necessarily mean that to believe in the Bible, you must disbelieve in the glacial period and in the vast antiquity of man. We're dealing actually with a problem in physical phenomena, or a problem of internal experience, and not necessarily merely with something that might have happened in the world 4,000 or 5,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. Recognizing this remedy as being very important to us, we can begin to understand again certain of the uses of the terms and signs and symbols which we find in the English law. If you even had a great deal of interesting and adventurous time with these stuff. I want to take the second of the basic names that we referred to, and that we will again also put now in a vertical form. You have to be very careful not to connect this letter here. If you connect, it becomes a different letter. But now we have the four letters of the name of Jehovah, or Yahweh, or the Lord, placed in a vertical position. The moment they are placed in that position, we see that they form the human body. It's very obvious. Now there's an interesting statement in the Bible that the man is the head of the woman. Is there really trust that? It's a very convenient statement. All right. And that can cause a lot of trouble in one day. You don't believe that anymore. But here I want to say that we go back to the old rabbinical law, and we take the head away. What do we have left in Hebrew? We have H, D, H, or E, D, E. Therefore, we have, a strange problem. If we take away the head, we have the woman left. We have a very deep and wonderful mystery contained within this story. In the ancient methods of study and writing and so on, the use of these Kabbalah forms are tremendously stimulating and interesting.
Because actually the name of deity is composed of four parts, represented by the four letters, which in turn represent the power of God in the four worlds, which include, of course, Thea, Ethera, and Rhea, and the other parts of the ancient great universe. The symbol of Eve became, in the ancient Hebrew, the symbol of the world soul, or the psychic nature of man. And of course, it is in this context that we find the division used in the Bible. In the great commentaries on Genesis, found in the old Jewish writings, you find, according to the story, that Adam was created as lovely. That it consisted of two bodies back to back. And the so-called creative act consisted of the separating of these two bodies, each of which faced a different way. And according to the old Mosaic tradition, have always faced a different way ever since. Against these two, each facing a different way, traveling as far as they can, apart, is ultimately used. Because they must inevitably travel in the great circle of absolute, or the tremendous cycle of time, so that the further they apart they get, the nearer they come together, which the old scholars knew at a very ancient time. They realized, as Einstein later demonstrated, the curvature of the continuum, and that anything continuing forever in a straight line will form a circle. So in the Old Testament and in all these writings, Eve, the mother of the living, and the great symbol of the creative psychic power of deity, was an essential attribute of deity, which was transferred in the formation of male and female from the universe to man himself. So that in a mysterious way, deity was divided to form man. And the reformation, or the union of man as male and female, restored deity. It is we're getting into relative water, but the philosophy of each step of this is deep, and leads us almost inevitably to realize that the Bible is a very wonderful work if we can understand it. Now, in the beginning, according to Genesis, the spirits of Elohim moved upon the face of the deep. That is, a tremendous creative power moved in the form of the fiery whirlwind. In the Greeks, it is said, universal creation was the result of the striving of ether and chaos. And in the East Indian philosophies, we have the same concept, the formation of the great age of the Arankayava, was formed out of the whirlings of space. And the striving, or as it was called, the labors or bearings of space, resulted gradually in the emergence of a conditioned existence out of an unconditioned existence. This is far better in the actual Jewish than the translation that we have in English. For much nearer to the meaning would be in the first chapter of Genesis. Out of the everlasting, we say in the beginning. But more correctly, it would be out of the everlasting. The male-female creating power fashioned or caused to emerge or generated of themselves the substances of the superior and the inferior creation. In other words, they brought forth two things, like the gold and silver hemispheres of the great age of change in creation. They brought forth differentiation. In the Pythagorean, the one fell into the two that become the basis of diversity. So in the beginning, an unconditioned and eternal state was divided into conditions. And in this condition which first existed, there was that which was inner and that which was outward, that which was superior and that which was inferior, that which was above and that which was below, all in terms of quality, not in terms of location. And out of these two polarized principles, all ether and chaos for the Greeks, there were fashioned or caused to come forth the mysterious principle of creation itself. Creation, in order to exist by the Leviticus code of the old law, must first become unbalanced. Space must unbalance itself, creating a superior and inferior, an abundance and a privation, a this and a that. And out of these imbalances, the great motion toward equilibrium began, and creation is the motion toward equilibrium. Thus we have in the Safar Zohar, the books of the splendors, the old statement that unbalanced forces perish in the void. Thus passed the giants, the kings of Edom of ancient times. Unbalance is in itself inevitably destructive. Therefore, the moment it comes into existence, every resource of the universe moves toward equilibrium. Because unbalance cannot be permitted to continue. And yet unbalance is the dynamic. Unbalance is therefore original sin, because it is the only thing in the universe that requires and demands and must have immediate correction. Therefore, the moment unbalance exists, every potential of nature moves towards the restoration of equilibrium, or the restoring of harmony. So in the beginning, the mysterious scales which we find in the Egyptian mystery tipped. In the tipping of the scales, objectivity was created. This tipping of the scales was the loss of totality, the breaking up of complete integration or wholeness, and the establishment of relatives in the place of the active. The moment these relatives were engendered, the moment relationships existed, they, in the words of the Greeks, they hastened toward each other to form again reintegration or reorganization. In the Hebrew tradition, it is taught that these two opposites, having become what we would term spirit and matter, or life and the absence of life, or relative absence of life, because even we know physicists were well aware of the fact that there is no total absence anywhere in nature. These lives, moving together, found that in the great cycle of existence, that they had built around themselves post-skin, bodies, forms. The Hebrew word is almost the same as the Greek, and that is chiton, meaning a coat or a garment. And these coats of skin, personality, inhibit the reunion of divided parts. Therefore, things seem to meet, but they do not, because the life within them is prevented from mingling, because of the external instruments which have been created through time and existence. Thus, the motion toward identity is frustrated by the instruments which these divided parts have fashioned for themselves. Thus, we have minds and emotions and bodies and instincts and attitudes and aptitudes and appetites. And by these we are divided. And by these, the unified life within us is unable to be restored in its original pattern and form. Thus, the answer became the second part of our great problem. We follow through in the story of Genesis, and we observe the gradual intensification of the conflict between reality and unreality. The conflict that has to exist, or reality itself, is without substantiation or without truth. It is only, therefore, through the experience of illusion that man is capable of the acceptation of reality. Good example of this is the Tower of Babel. Here we find the individual or man attempting to break through or to pierce into the mysteries of heaven. We find him creating a great ziggurat or tower from the earth, which is to reach up to the gods. We find this end only in a confusion of tongues, which is an internal reminder of man that the things which he builds with bricks of mud without straw. Thus, the entire story of man's attempt to physically conquer the mystery of life is psychologically revealed in the fable of the Tower of Babylon. The tower which finally collapsed and resulted in the confusion of tongues, Now we assume that these confusing tongues represent the breaking up of language. But this is not actually true, because we understand that language speaks of the entire mystery that we are dealing with here. The division of tongues means actually the division of man's comprehensive power here. A subject that is being restored to us after many centuries by the rising of Leviticus. We know, for instance, that the confusion is not in the form of the word, but in our meaning. And that every word means to the individual only what he himself possesses of knowledge. Therefore, that through words we cannot actually communicate ideas, except that those we communicate must be on a common level. Otherwise, words, and there is no profit in that. This experience we have all more or less gone through. Now, also in the opening chapters of Genesis, we come upon the Noah legend. The legend of Noah and his wonderful ark, and of the first destruction of the world, of the final passing away of the antediluvian creation. These are all psychological experiences within the human being himself. And in the theological systems of other nations, we find accounts which are parallel to those in Genesis. For instance, in the Chinese system, the first patriarch, his wife, their three sons, and their daughters were all brought into a ship and carried over to oblivion, exactly as in the Jewish story. We have an almost identical account in India also of an extraordinary antiquity, far older than anything that we have in the South China area. So that we know that we are dealing with principles. We know that we are dealing with power. We know also that we are dealing with archetypal forms which will return in the experience of the individual in each of the culture systems which he produces. In the Noah legend, we find, for example, the return or the retiring of the creation. We find the destruction of an old world and all that it stood for. We find the good man and his family saved by divine intercession. And that from this good man and his family and from the clean of the unclean animals of the earth, a repopulation came forth. So that Noah occupied the situation or position of a second Adam. And there's no mystery in the ancient times and in the ancient tapestry. Now in the Hebrew also we have Adam's platform. Adam of the rendering. We know that this Adam Cosmos is the archetype of man, the protagonist of Plato. That Adam represents the collective, and in his numerical power is identical with that of the temple of Jerusalem. We know, therefore, that in a mysterious way in the Old and New Testament that the destiny of Adam is linked with that of the Messiah. For the first shall be last. And every one of these figures has in it and has a complete and wonderful existence for us. In approaching these problems, we have been inclined, perhaps to be a little influenced by veneration. We have not felt, perhaps, that the mysteries of heaven were for us. But therefore, it was our problem and our duty and our responsibility merely to believe and follow. This, however, is not the general attitude of even the old Jewish scholars. They firmly believe that the supreme power had given them faculties and abilities in order that they could use them. They did not feel that the divine being would have bestowed upon man a mind and the powers to think if he was not expected to use them. And that as the most natural inquiry of the mind is its relation to itself and to its origin and to its destiny, these questions must be proper to man or he could not fashion them within his own consciousness. Therefore, we come to a certain statement in the Old Testament, which I think is a good example of poor translation. There's a line in the Bible which says, the mysteries of God are below the skin. Well, actually, we are not translating the words correct. The key words of it are that the sword is for the catechism. Now, that does not mean that the mysteries of God are below the skin. The sword is the body, or the arcana, the total wisdom. It is the tremendous esoteric law, the complete structure of truth and understanding as it is conceivable to man. The word has two essential meanings. One, wisdom itself, and another, the circle or guardian of wisdom. The term is almost interchangeable. Well, the second part is, in other words, eternal wisdom, or the great truth, or the inevitable realities are for the Hasidus. Now, the Hasidim, or Hasidus, represented the initiation of the ancient rites, those who were the advanced priests, those who were privileged to enter into the Holy Place, those who had purified and practiced the disciplines that had dedicated their lives to God. Therefore, our word is not the mysteries of God or for those who fear Him, but that the eternal wisdom is for those who are worthy, who are dedicated, who have made the necessary advancement and proficiency, and are in themselves enlightened and consecrated. Now that is quite a different meaning, because there is no part of the statement which implies fear. It implies entirely devotion, integrity, and attainment. Thus, we have followed for a long time certain misconceptions which can and do affect our ability to understand the basic situation. Go on then, also, we have to pause for a moment now and consider the life of Moses, because of his tremendous place in this entire context. The word Moses, we consider to apply primarily to a man. And we are looking somewhere in the story, in this conflict between the Jewish scholars, the Christian scholars, the modern scientists, and the unbelievers, who are all more or less lost on these problems. We are looking for the true meaning of this. Now, we have no reason to doubt the historicity of Moses. In other words, we can by no means question or fail the probabilities of his life. But wherever we find a human and natural person involved in a religious mystery, or incorporated ultimately into a scriptural writing, we find certain changes made in the statistical or historical story of his life. We find that he is drastically transformed into an archetypal form. In other words, he must be more than a person. He must be the embodiment of the doctrine which he brings. So by degrees, step by step, the human attributes come to be generally ignored. Little by little, he emerges only in his archetypal form. They're no longer primarily interested in the normal daily occurrences of his life. They are not interested in his personal mistakes or his personal limitations. Gradually, he assumes the form of the universal embodiment of a doctrine. We know this occurred in the case of Moses, and we suspect, therefore, that we do not even know the name of the man with whom the story is now associated. Moses is a combination of letters, and is a very important combination of letters. It is almost too important to be a name. It is too fortuitous to be a name. Because all we have to do is follow a certain rule of the ancient Jewish gematria, and rearrange these letters according to the formula. And we have, instead of Moses, Samach. And the moment we have Samach, we have the sun. So we know that Moses is the solar being. We know, therefore, that he has been gradually associated with the sun's cycle. In other words, that there is lurking, concealed somewhere in this story, what we know today as the astronomical mythos. We know that Moses is therefore also an embodiment of the symbolical principle for which the sun itself stands in nature. Because even though Muhammad is so-called sun worshiper, he did not and never did worship the physical body of the sun. He worshipped a principle. He worshipped the principle of life. He worshipped the principle of truth, which is inner life. He worshipped the principle of reality, which by its own existence dispels darkness. In other words, sun worship is light worship. Light worship is a symbolic statement of truth worship. It is the statement of man's concept of the victory of mental, spiritual, and life over ignorance, darkness, sin, and death.
It can always exist. So we are not surprised to find in the name of Moses the secret concealed name of the sun deity. We are inevitably likely to find this. Moses was a light bearer. Moses was a light giver to his people. That they should have honored him by representing him symbolically as a kind of sun rising out of darkness. Would only be appropriate to what we generally know already, or what we already have reason to explain or understand in these religions. The life of Moses, therefore, has to do with Israel, with the descent of a chosen people, and with the emergence of himself as an archetypal symbol of the Mosaic law. He is the law. He is the law personified or embodied. He is strangely and wonderfully expresses not only its depth but its limitations. He is the revealer and he is the statement of the revelation. And as you study his relation to the structure of the Pentateuch, you become more and more convinced that you're dealing with a principle rather than essentially a person. Now this does not mean that we deny the person lives. But we also know that even in Christianity, this particular situation has dynamically arisen. In the 4th century, one of the popes said that the 25th day of December is not so sacred for the birth of Jesus as for the annual birth of the sun. We know also that the birth of Jesus was made to coincide with the winter solstice at a considerably later time than we would first imagine. We realize that all of these stories finally do tie with an astronomical phenomenon that was noted and recorded at a very early date by primitive people, most of whom were involved in what we call astrology, or the religion of the stars, the religion of the bodies moving in the heavens. In fact, it is clearly indicated in the vision of Ezekiel, and in parts of the vision of Isaiah, and many others of the early prophetic and literary books of the Bible. Moses, therefore, must be understood as representing the archetypal concept of law. He is the law. And the story of Moses is the story of the law unfolding in a people. And it is also the story of the revelation of a great moral code. A code that not only we should examine, but the basic reason for which we should try to understand. Now with Moses, as with most of the other characters which are involved in the Old Testament story, we see a descent also of beliefs and traditions. Moses found in the bulrushes. Moses raised in the land of Egypt, which is the symbol of darkness, always in the biblical account. The same as the city of Babylon in the stories or the famous theological writing of St. Augustine. Always the city of Egypt represents matter, darkness, ignorance, materiality. It represents the same in the glory of the prodigal son, which is another example of the same basic idea. The prodigal son goes into the land of Egypt and wastes his substance and riotous living, and finally returns to his father's house, where he is forgiven and the fatted calf is offered for him. These stories all have to do with the cycle of life, and with the cycle of the revelation of consciousness and form. And on that psychological level, they are tremendously important. Now, if you will look back at the different doctrines and beliefs, and even the fairy tales and legends that you have enjoyed and known through the years, you will find the constant repetition of the Moses figure. The Moses figure is specifically we always think of it as a magnificent form that is represented in statues by Michelangelo. You see this great bearded angel. It looks almost like the proverbial concept of God himself. You see him leading his people through the mysteries of the wilderness. You see him leading them out of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, and all of these stories which will later have much more meaning to us. We find him also bringing them ultimately to the promised land, and there on the lonely hill of Moab, this great teacher and leader of his people, lies down to sleep with his fathers. He is not allowed to enter into the promised land because of a sin which he committed, because he broke the faith of God, because he broke the tablets of the law, and because he doubted when he struck the rock with his wand. For these things he might not enter in. He was permitted to see this land of promise from the mountain. And then he went to sleep with the angels. And the place knew him no more, and his body was never found. This interesting parallel story is itself a very interesting and wonderful story. In the Jewish legendary and lore, it is said that God did not send the angel of death to receive to himself the soul of Moses. The Lord came himself and took him home. And this is the concept behind this very strange and deep and wonderful story. But who was it that led the children of Israel into the promised land? It was Jehoshua, the son of Nun. Now, what is Jehoshua, the son of Nun? If you write it in Hebrew, you have exactly the same thing as Jesus, the son of the fish. Because the word Nun means fish. The earliest sign of the Christian was fish drawn on the sand. Known long before the Christian communion knew there was such a thing as a cross associated with their religion. So the sign of the fish was the ancient symbol of recognition. And the name of Jesus himself becomes, according to St. Augustine, a mysterious cabal by using the first letter. We find that from his name comes the name of the fish. We also know that the papal reign is the fisherman's reign. That the great fisherman was the one upon whose foundations the church was built. And that there was a mysterious coin or gold of great merit that was found in the fish's mouth. All these legends are interesting, especially when we tie them to Jehoshua the son of Nun, who must lead the children of Israel along the 49th road of the great Sephirah into the promised land. When Jesus passed Moses passed through 49 gates of the mystery, but only Jesus passed through the 50th, according to the early development of the Christian thought. So these things all have their stories, and they all have their involved and intricate and important and wonderful meaning. So we'll follow the life of Moses, but we will follow it a little indirectly, because I want to tie it more directly with the story of the books themselves, with which we have to have a certain amount of consideration. Now, as we've told you, the book of Genesis, by the representation of the nature of creation, by making a definite statement of the outworkings and unfoldings of the divine will, and how these unfoldings were frustrated by the temptation of Eve, the fall of man, and the exile from the garden, and how as a result of this exile, man was forced to go forth and earn his bread with the sweat of his brow. And how later we find the tragedy of Cain and Abel and the birth of Seth and the foundation of priesthood. All these we find because we know that Israel was not only a person, a tribe, but it was also an epitome of the ancient Jewish concept of all humanity. Israel was humanity, but not essentially originally a race or a nation. It only gradually developed into this as the national pride, national existence took more and more definite shape and form in the minds. But in Genesis, then, we have the foundations of the Pentateuch dispensation, the law and the prophets. We have the concept arising in this that religion is obedience to law. That therefore man worships God by keeping the covenant of God. And that which is pleasing under the law brings with it the security and peace of man. Thus we have a very definite statement that religion is keeping the divine plan, keeping the laws that God has created. Now, where these laws exist, and they are affirmed to exist in Genesis, and we see the gradual unfoldment of these laws. It becomes obvious to anyone that laws can exist without man knowing what they are. And that when we have been admonished to keep a law, we may be at a sovereign disadvantage. We may not know what the law is. Well, that is not uncommon even in our day of life. There are many people who say, what is good? We simply are not sure. We are not certain to what degree our own judgment, our own patterns, even our general acceptances, our traditions, our creeds, and our codes are true. We do not know. Therefore, the admonition to keep the law must inevitably require the revelation of that law. Someone must know it. And the creation of this concept that man must keep the statutes immediately requires the emergence of the lawgiver. We have not the evidence or proof that these laws are so visibly written that primitive man could understand them. In fact, they are not so visibly written that modern man can understand them. He sees phases, aspects, parts of it, but he is not certain of their totality. He is not certain of what is good in this situation or what is bad in that situation. Thus, the moment we have the revelation, the fiat of the divine evil, we then naturally and inevitably are faced with the problem: what is the truth? What is the law? How and where should we experience or find the law? So we find in Genesis the beginning of this problem, the statement of it, the gradual unfolding of certain of its basic principles. But we do not yet have the full statement of it. So in the Exodus, which is the second truth, the second book of this truth, we find the gradual unfoldment of the law. And we find that the law unfolded in Exodus just as it unfolds in the life of the human being. It unfolds through the gradual enrichment of man's experience. It unfolds through historical perspective. It develops through time and circumstance, and especially under the emergency of great and pressing need. During and under which conditions there is greater demand for integrity, greater reliance upon truth. So that the Exodus carries the children of Israel in the long road which leads to the integration of their society, their integration nationally, their integration culturally, their integration religiously. We find them fully building the house of their existence. Not only the physical house, for this was still a period of wanting, but a house of conviction, a house of social and psychic patterns, preparing the way, recognizing the need, testing and trying and proving their own development. This book, Exodus particularly, is one of the most powerful historical and psychological documents in the entire Bible, where it supports the general belief of the modern sociologist that the only way in which revelation is possible is through the gradual unfoldment of the native psychic entity of a people. That these people must bring forth from themselves that which is necessary to them. The revelation is therefore released. That it is knowledge, wisdom, understanding moving through a people, binding them, uniting them, unfolding into a gradually integrating pattern. This integrating pattern, we see, is gradually taking form. We have it interrupted by innumerable side deviations from the principal text. By the time we end the study of the Exodus, we see a people emerging into a nation, into a united cooperative unit, a people forming a body. And as the body of man must pass through its infancy
man through its early growth, before it is capable of sustaining the soul within it, before the soul power is capable of moving through it and releasing it. So, in the story of the Exodus, we find the gradual integration of the collective or of the individual life. This motion forth as sufficiency and the security suitable to receive further knowledge. And this leads inevitably into the third book, which is the Leviticus. And the Leviticus is nothing more or less than the immediate unfolding of the Levitical ministry as such. And here we find the body of the law slowly taking upon itself its own psychic nature. We find the law becoming the vehicle for the actual presence of an indwelling or an internal truth. We find, for example, the Shekinah column gradually moving. We see the integration of the tabernacle mysteries. We see the Spirit of the Lord hovering over the mercy seat. We know the Shekinah glory. And we know that the worship of the great archangel Michael, who was the psychopompus of heaven and the secret God of Israel, was gradually taking shape. So in the Leviticus we find the more complete, almost complete, revelation of the whole code, insofar as that code could be sustained and supported by these people. It was the motion of the people toward the integration of their great religious mystery system. It was in the cycle of Leviticus that we find the beginnings of the Kabbalah, beginnings of secret knowledge, beginnings of the wisdom that is only for those who have advanced in the apperception of mysteries. So out of the people we find a priesthood. And what is a priesthood? Ever. The priesthood is always simply the symbolical pattern of man's own psychic possessions. The soul within man is his priesthood. And the collective soul of a people is his priesthood. It's must God lead and direct the spiritual and material destiny of that people. So in Leviticus, the old dispensation, the law of the Pentateuch is ensouled and becomes a living thing. The breath of life in the form of the great religious overtones are bestowed, and the people is consecrated. It is united as one body of the Lord, as the hands and feet of the Eternal. Now in this also, we have a further problem. For as soon as man's psychic life integrates, what happens? Does he immediately become happy? Unfortunately not. It is not that easy. The moment the individual takes control of his own spiritual life or his own destiny from within himself, he faces the most difficult situation he has ever faced in his life. He faces what has been called the desert. This is the great place of wandering. So that we have inevitably Leviticus leading to Numbers. Numbers, which is that part which essentially deals with the story of the great sorrow in the wilderness, the great the struggle against worldliness, the struggle between the rising power of eternal life and the darkness of environment. For it is only when the soul is enlightened that it is aware of the conflict or the contrast between itself and that which is not itself, that which constitutes the period in the wilderness. Therefore, the story, as we find it in Numbers, is like the initiation ritual of one of the old mysteries. It is the story of man's wandering. It is the prodigal son seeking again his father's house. It is also the story of Potiphar, the guy in his school, who, having forgotten or lost the way to the temple of Mount Olivet, must wander in black armor for many years, seeking again his own mysterious spiritual heritage. This wandering through the desert is the substance and burden of the Odyssey and Iliad of Homer, because in the return of Ulysses or Odysseus to his own far distant native land, we find the story of the journey of the soul through the wilderness.
Among the pietists of provincial Pennsylvania, here among the Dutch people, they had a society which was called the Society of the Woman of the Wilderness. And it represented the concept of human travailing darkness seeking for truth. This is essentially the story of the wandering of the tribes of Israel. And when we recognize, for instance, that the 12 tribes can symbolize the 12 convolutions of the human brain, and consequently all of the attributes of man's thought and emotions, we can see why the wanderings of these through the wilderness of ignorance is an almost inevitable prerequisite to the attainment of wisdom and security. We have, therefore, this symbolic pattern moving through. But the great and wonderful point in connection with this phase of the story is the revelation of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, of course, the biblical account of this is comparatively abridged, but there is much more to be found in the old Jewish tradition than has ever been brought out and brought to the consideration of non-Jewish scholars. According to the old tradition, Moses ascended Mount Sinai 3 times. On the first ascent of the mountain, he was given the Torah. And the Torah is the law. The Torah is the essential statute. It is the root and source of the great Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud, which lays combinations and collections of the law. It is a tremendous revelation of jurisprudence, and probably one of the greatest and deepest of all legal codes. The Mosaic law was for the government of people. It was for the government of a wild and nomadic people. And yet it threw them and brought them under the recognition that civil law and religious law are the same thing, that there was no essential division between them, and that by keeping faith with each other, they kept faith with God. That there could be no deviation. Man could not break civil law without breaking sacred law. We have gradually divided the category. Therefore, we today say that to break a civil law is a crime, to break a religious law is a sin. But in ancient times, there was no division between these. That which was a crime was a sin, and vice versa. So the great code, the Torah, was revealed to Moses on the first ascent of Mount Sinai and required for 40 days and 40 nights. He then ascended the mountain a second time. And on the second ascent, he was given the Mishnah, which is one of the more mystical and secret writings of the Jews. The Mishnah is called the soul of the law. The Torah is the body of the law. Mishnah is also a work of instruction suitable for the priest, particularly, but also available to the people. And it is called the soul of the law. And it is intimately associated with the ancient statement. The body or letter of the law killeth, but the spirit of the law giveth life. Therefore, the Mishnah was the soul or spirit of the law which gave life. Now, what is life in this sense? In the Mishnah, we learn that life is understanding, and that the whole letter of the law becomes warm with life when we understand the reason for the obedience that is required. That when we understand fully and completely, we no longer fear the law, but recognize it as the greater good. Therefore, our fear is gradually transformed into respect. And the Mishnah, which gives man the internal understanding of the Torah, and brings this law to life in him and for him, causing it to become a directive of a conduct pattern based upon a rich and warm ideal. This is properly and appropriately called the soul of the law. This is the law for those who are learning, for the thoughtful. We would say today that it is the revelation of the law for the individual who wishes to live better than upon the surface of things. We might term it mystical, philosophical. We might conceive it even to be psychological, because it is something which makes things more real, more true, more valuable. The third time Moses ascended the mountain and remained again for 40 days and 40 nights, he received the Kabbalah, the secret doctrine of Israel, the spirit of the Lord. He received in this way the great keys to the revelation. And in the Christian dispensation, the papal keys, which were supposed to have been presented to St. Peter, consisted of a silver and a golden key, and they are crossed on the papal arms even today. Well, the silver key is the Kabbalah Moses. The silver key is the mysterious wisdom which unlocks all the mysteries of the Old Testament. The golden key is the symbol in this case of the key which unlocks the mysteries of the Messianic dispensation. So the gold key unlocks the mystery of the law, the golden key unlocks the mystery of grace. And the law and the grace are the two great columns represented by the campanella on the fronts of churches. In Notre Dame d'Italie, there are the two great towers. One is the power of the prophets, and the other is the power of grace. That man shall enter in between law and grace, which is appropriate and proper to this history. Moses, in receiving the Kabbalah, received the great keys of Gematria and Leviticus, the methods of unlocking the secret riddles. He became aware of the meanings of all of the words, and he received also the Sefer Hedibrim, the book of the words, by means of which all of these mysterious terms can be unlocked. He was then in the position that is described a little later in the early meeting book here by Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, known better as Maimonides, the great Jewish teacher and priest philosopher. He declared that the mysteries of truth, like the human body, consist of three parts. First, there is the garment, which conceals the body. This is the Torah. This is the body of the law. Then there is the body, which is contained within the garment. This is the Mishnah, which is the soul. And then there is a light which is contained within the body. And this is the innermost. And this is the Kabbalah. And as a man so a wisdom, it must be threefold in three parts. Its inner part veiled by its outer members. And its outer part are for all. The parts are for all. But the inner part is only for Atheists, those who are dedicated eternally to the service of God. And the revelation of the Mishnah is to the prophets. And the revelation of the Kabbalah is to the saints. Or to the holy ones who have been sent by special revelation. And it is said in the old words later that the secrets of the Kabbalah were entrusted to Solomon, king of Israel. And we want to pause here just a moment because in referring to Pentateuch, we're referring to the 5 books of Moses. And we are well aware, and the question has recently been asked us, what of the 6th and 7th books of Moses? There are 2 books that are generally found in paper binding and are extant publications that are called the 6th and 7th books of Moses. And we must pause for a moment on this particular subject. Because of the nature of the Jewish doctrine and the Jewish revelation, and because of its tremendous emphasis upon the septenarial division of the universe, there is a very ancient legend that the original books of Moses were 7, and that 2 were concealed or hidden. This was because man has 5 vowels, and a 6th and 7th partial vowel, represented today by 2 consonants, with partly vowel sounds. There is a 6th and 7th vowel. Man has 5 senses, but there is a 6th and 7th sense concealed within him, not yet developed. Also in the Bodhisattva doctrine of Northern Buddhism, the Mahayana system, there are 5 Jnana Buddhas, but there are 2 others hidden.
For in the ancient system, there were always 5 revealed and 2 concealed. And the ancient said that this was according to the law and the body. For in man, there were supposedly 5 vital parts revealed and 2 concealed. And in the life of man, there are 5 parts which are regarded as perfect, and 2 which are regarded as imperfect. And the creation itself requires 7 days. And all of these working together would lead to the assumption that the great Kabbalistic schemes from which the Mosaic doctrines originally received their form and final presentation may very well have possessed what were called the 6th and 7th books of Moses. There also are, according to the Oriental anthropologists, there are 5 races upon the earth, and the 6th and 7th yet to come. In the old system of astronomy, not our present system, there were 5 planets, a sun and moon, or 2 luminaries, which substituted for 2 planets which we have later discovered. The ancients knew they existed, but did not desire to reveal them. So this concealment of 2 in the midst of 5 is a very ancient formula of Kabbalah and related material. In this concept, it was believed that the 6th and 7th books of Moses were held in secret by a mysterious order which arose among the ancient Jews. And that these 2 books, because of the final failure of man to meet the challenge of the dispensation, were taken back to the heavenly college by the angel Raziel, and are no longer upon the earth, because man was not yet worthy of them. But that in the fullness of time, these other 2 books would come and would be revealed. And of course, the 7th book is the famous book without words, because on the 7th day is the great rest, or the Sabbath, or the eternal silence. So that the 7th book is the book of the great silence, the seals of which may never be opened. But what we call today the 6th and 7th books of Moses, and what are now in circulation, are really, I hate to say it because I'm not of the critical mind normally, they're just old-fashioned forgery. They arose at a time in the medieval period when men's minds were greatly involved in witchcraft. And witchcraft and demonology did arise among the Jewish communities after the diaspora, or the scattering of Israel. Therefore, in the old Polish synagogues and in various parts of Europe, there were old rabbins who followed ceremonial magic, who tried to raise spirits like Palestimones. And a very good play dealing with that subject has been very popular in this country. It's called The Book. And this is the story of the enchantment, of witchcraft, of witch spelling of spirits. And there's not at all unlike corresponding stories found in the annals of the Inquisition, like the Maleficarum and other similar parallels. But the 6th and 7th books of Moses are in the class of grimoires, or books of magical formulas. They have no basic origin in the original doctrine. They would not rather be said to be perversions or degeneration of the great basic principles of ceremonial magic. Ceremonial magic was part of the Kabbalah. Ceremonial magic dealt with man's ability to control the powers of the universe. But these secrets were never revealed, and they cannot be bought for 25 cents in the nearest newsstand. I assure you, I wouldn't become at all excited over the prospect. Now we turn again for a moment to the story of Moses. One of the important things that we learn concerning the story of Moses are certain legends relating to the revelation of the tablets of the law on Sinai. These revelations tell us that the 2 tablets of the law were what was called in that time the male and female tablets. In other words, one tablet had letters raised upon it, and the other had letters engraved into it, so that when the 2 halves of the tablet met, they became one solid stone. We are now assuming, of course, that on these tablets were originally written
the Ten Commandments as we know them. That is not essentially true. They were not so inscribed. In the oldest known form, tablets contained 2 columns of letters. Each tablet with 5 letters. These letters, in turn, contain the sonographic abridgments of certain words from which other combinations could be made. At another time, they contain the 10 names of the septile, or the tree of creation, the 10 names of the 10 worlds, each one of which a law or a certain truth was intrinsic. These tables were originally, it is said, upon a transparent stone. And this transparent stone, according to one account at least, was given to Moses by God out of a mysterious abode in heaven, and it was called a sapphire. It was an enormous sapphire. And when Moses broke these tablets, in his repentance, he sought to restore them. He could not. Therefore, he copied the letters upon tables of stone. But the jewel which had been given to him in heaven had been shattered and lost, and the parts of it were returned to God. This man had not the original revelation, but carvings of it upon stone. Therefore, according to the ancient Jewish history, we have to understand that by the inscription upon stone, he represents the material law. The law which says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But that the law of mercy, because man had perverted it, was restored to heaven to wait for a better time. All of these little interludes coming into this story give it a great deal of richness and color and tremendous overtone, moral significance, and spiritual mystery. Also, it is said that when Moses ascended the mountain, he found upon the top of the mountain a great cloud. And as he approached it, the cloud opened. And he saw in the cloud, in the form of the cloud, a great cave leading apparently far into the sky, a cave of clouds. And in this cave, a great light hovered and floated, and from the light came the voice that instructed him. And as we study the story very definitely, we study Mount Sinai, and we compare it with all the world mountains and all the great religious hills and the mountains from whence cometh our help. And we know that what Moses is trying to tell us is the story of an internal spiritual experience. And that the entire story deals with man's retiring into the innermost part of himself. There is an early work on Jewish anatomy, which was circulated in Spain during the 15th century, which shows the world distributed on the human body. And in this arrangement, Mount Sinai is located in the heart. Therefore, we are beginning to sense that it is in the wandering in the wilderness that this mountain of help or strength is the heart. And that the heart again later becomes the symbol for the Ark of the Covenant and for the other mysterious symbols which are associated with the Jewish religious symbols. Thus Moses is telling us of a retiral into the innermost nature and the deeper parts of his own being. And the historical mountain is only a symbol of this other mountain. And Mount Ararat, upon which the ark descended, is also a symbolical mountain. For it is the mountain upon which the spiritual life of the race finally touches its material foundations. And in all these, like the steps upon the cave of the illumination of Buddha, in the rooms they hung the 7 rings, it is the heart. And in one of the old Egyptian manuscripts, we are told that the Great Pyramid was the heart which was set up in Egypt. So we have the mountain, the pyramid, the mound, all symbolizing the sanctuary of God. And that this sanctuary is essentially always symbolic of the human mind. So Moses enters into the holy place, into the high place of his own consciousness, into the aloneness and the aloofness. He transcends the world. He rises above mortal things. And there in an inner mystery, he receives the inward impression of the tables of the law. But when he trusts this impression to his mind and his outer personality, he cannot express it. He destroys it. He is unable to reveal it. All he can make is a copy of the stone. And
each of us who has ever had a very great and beautiful thought within ourselves knows what that means. We try so desperately to give that thought, to share that thought, that all we can pass on is a hollow, stone-like symbol of it, because the reality simply cannot be captured within our own experience. There is a very wonderful story relating to Moses at the time of the wars of Israel. And at that time, Moses went up to a hill, and he was old, and he could not stand long. Therefore, a rough stone, was placed for him to sit on. And on each side of Moses stood one of the great elders of the people of Israel. On one side stood Aaron, the priest. And on the other side stood Ehud, the general of the armies. And it was the law of that battle that as long as Moses' arms were held up, the children of Israel would be victorious. But the moment his arms fell, the enemy would win. And Moses was old, and he could not hold up his arms. So Aaron upon one side and Ehud upon the other side held up his arms for the day. And when night nearly came, and the battle was not decided, Moses asked the Lord to extend the day until the battle was completed. And on that occasion, the day was extended. And it was again extended in the time of Joshua. He was caused to make the sun stand still. But the story of Moses and his arms being upheld by Aaron and Ehud is very, very interesting, because Moses is the law. If men uphold the law, they are victorious. If they allow the law to fall or to fail, all is lost. So that the priesthood upon the one side, which is religion, and the general of the armies, which is man's knowledge, his science, his material attainments, both of these must sustain the law, one on each side. And if they sustain the law, the armies of Israel will be victorious over the kingdoms who would otherwise destroy them. And in this we have, of course, another evidence, a symbolic evidence, that we are referring primarily to Moses as the embodiment of a great hope. Who keeps the law is kept by the law. Who breaks the law perishes from the law. And in this, the law of the prophets are fulfilled. So in these 5 books, we have the evolution or the development of these 5 steps. We have in the last book, Deuteronomy, we have the 3 great discourses of Moses, in which he gives to his people the full knowledge and pure reflection of the law. He shows the law in its most natural nature. One moment firm and relentless, at another moment kind and gentle, sometimes apparently harsh and tyrannical, sometimes appearing to work for darkness, at other times with every solicitude for the most sensitive and tender consideration. And thus this is how we see the law, one moment as a tyrant and one moment as a benefactor. And having given his final instruction to his people, or revealed himself or himself through this great priesthood which he created, Moses, because he was not yet perfect, was not able to go as far as the people he was leading. And so he went to sleep on the hills of Moab, and the place knew him no more. But we have here a wonderful inner statement. The law is in us. The law is an elder, a strange prophet, patriarch, a voice of strength which comes to us in our own instincts. We are the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness. We have within ourselves the ancient one, the law, the tradition of our time. And in the mosaic of dispensation, the emphasis is upon the great body of the law that has descended to us. It's the law that has come from the experience of our people, the experience of our race, from the traditions of the good and the wise and the true. And in each one of us, there is an archetypal form of law. An archetypal form which has come within our own consciousness and our own understanding. It is the law of the folk. It is the law of the race. The law of the time. We are born in it. It is in our blood. It comes down to us from the first nutrition that we receive from our mothers. It is the law of our time. It is the law of the jungle, of the plain, of the desert. It is the law that the animal and man both must obey. And this is the old law. The law which goes on forever, perishes, represented by the patriarchal concept. Now it is against this law, we find the rise of the Messianic tradition, not only among Christians, but also among the Jewish people themselves. For the law led inevitably to the prophets. And because the prophets were the ones who broke through the law, because the prophets were the ones who had the vision of a great release from the concept of law as dominance, release from the law as strength or pressure. It's because of that the prophets began to sing. It's because of this release that we have Isaiah. It's because of the problem, the burden of it, that we have Job. It also is the burden of the release of Ezekiel. And we find something of this new note, this new tremendous power in the songs of Ruth and Esther. So that from the law, a people passes inevitable. From the acceptance, from obedience, from domination, towards a mystical release. And this mystical release we begin to consider in what we term the prophetic.